The narrative you've constructed about the avoidant person in your life is probably keeping you trapped far more effectively than their actual behavior ever could. You've taken their emotional unavailability and reframed it as depth and mystery. You've interpreted their inability to commit as evidence of a wounded soul that just needs the right person to heal them. You've romanticized their hot and cold behavior as passion and intensity rather than recognizing it as dysfunction and manipulation. You've convinced yourself that their withdrawal means they care so much it scares them, that their silence means they're processing deep feelings, that their inconsistency means they're battling internal demons rather than simply being unable or unwilling to show up. This romanticized narrative transforms their limitations into virtues, their dysfunction into complexity, their emotional immaturity into depth. It allows you to stay invested in someone who is fundamentally unavailable by reframing their unavailability as something noble or profound, rather than what it actually is, a pattern of behavior that prevents genuine intimacy and leaves you perpetually unsatisfied. The truth you need to accept is far less romantic, but infinitely more liberating. The avoidant person is not a tortured soul waiting for the right love to heal them. They're someone who learned dysfunctional patterns in childhood and has continued those patterns into adulthood without doing the work to change them. They're not mysterious or complex. They're predictable and repetitive. They're not deeply feeling, but afraid to show it. They're defended against feeling anything too deeply because feeling requires vulnerability. They've organized their life around avoiding. Accepting this unglamorous truth is what finally sets you free from the cycle of hoping, waiting, and accepting crumbs while calling it love. They're not deep. They're disconnected from their emotions. One of the most common romanticizations of avoidant people is the belief that they're deeply emotional but simply struggle to express their feelings. This narrative casts them as sensitive souls overwhelmed by the intensity of their emotions, unable to articulate the depth of what they feel. You interpret their silence as evidence of profound inner experience, their withdrawal a sign of feelings so powerful they cannot be contained or expressed. This interpretation is comforting because it suggests that underneath their unavailability lies a rich emotional landscape that you might access if you're patient enough, understanding enough, special enough. But this interpretation is almost certainly wrong. The reality is that most avoidant people are not experiencing deep emotions they're struggling to express. They're experiencing minimal emotions because they've spent their entire lives developing strategies to avoid feeling deeply. The avoidant person's defensive structure is specifically designed to prevent emotional intensity, not to contain it. They learned early that emotions are dangerous, that expressing feelings leads to rejection or creates burden, that the safest path is to minimize emotional experience altogether. They developed patterns of intellectualization, distraction, and disconnection that prevent emotions from arising with any intensity in the first place. When the avoidant person is silent, they're typically not sitting with overwhelming feelings. They're often feeling very little, having successfully employed their defensive strategies to shut down emotional response. When they withdraw, it's not because their feelings are too intense to handle. It's because the beginning stirrings of feeling activate their defense system and they disconnect from those feelings before they can develop into anything substantial. The avoidant person has become remarkably skilled at preventing emotional depth rather than at containing emotional depth they're experiencing. This distinction is crucial because it reveals that the avoidant person's problem is not expression, but experience. They don't feel deeply and struggle to communicate those feelings. They struggle to feel deeply in the first place. Their emotional range is constricted by their defenses, operating in a narrow band that never reaches the intensity you imagine they're experiencing. They might feel mild affection, slight irritation, vague discomfort, but they rarely allow themselves to feel passionate love, intense anger, profound sadness, or any emotion that would make them vulnerable or out of control. The romanticization of the avoidant person as deeply emotional serves a defensive function for you. It allows you to maintain hope that connection exists beneath their distant exterior, that your efforts to reach them are worthwhile because there's something there to reach. But this hope is based on projection rather than reality. You're attributing to them the emotional depth you would feel in their situation, rather than recognizing that they feel very differently than you do. When you would be overwhelmed with feelings, they're often feeling relatively little. When you would be struggling with intense emotion, they've successfully avoided that intensity through their well-practiced defenses. The avoidant person's disconnection from their emotions is not a temporary state they'll move through with time and patience. It's a fundamental feature of their personality structure that developed over decades and is maintained through constant reinforcement. Every time they successfully avoid feeling something intense, every time they shut down emotional response before it becomes overwhelming, every time they intellectualize their experience rather than feeling it, they're strengthening the neural pathways that keep them emotionally disconnected. This pattern is not something that changes easily or quickly. It requires sustained therapeutic work specifically focused on emotional access and expression, work that most avoidant people never undertake. The truth is that the avoidant person's emotional disconnection makes them less interesting and complex, not more. Emotional depth creates richness in human experience and relationships. The capacity to feel intensely, to be moved by experiences and connections, to access the full range of human emotion is what creates the depth and meaning you're drawn to in life. The avoidant person's constricted emotional range means they experience life in muted tones, missing much of the richness that emotional depth provides. They're not mysteriously complex. They're limited in ways that prevent them from experiencing and offering the intimacy you seek. This limitation shows up in specific ways that you've probably noticed but reinterpreted through a romantic lens. The avoidant person doesn't express enthusiasm about experiences or future plans. You tell yourself they're just more reserved or they show excitement differently. The reality is they don't feel much enthusiasm because allowing themselves to want or anticipate something creates vulnerability to disappointment. The avoidant person doesn't seem deeply affected when you're upset or hurt. You tell yourself they're processing internally or they show care in other ways. The reality is they don't feel your pain deeply because allowing empathetic connection to your emotions would be overwhelming to their defended system. The avoidant person doesn't share vulnerabilities or fears beyond surface level. You tell yourself they're private or they need more time to open up. The reality is they don't access those vulnerabilities themselves most of the time because their defense system keeps them from examining their fears and insecurities closely enough to articulate them. The avoidant person doesn't fight passionately or engage intensely during conflicts. You tell yourself they're conflict avoidant or they need space to process. The reality is they don't feel intensely enough about the issues to engage passionately, and their primary goal during conflict is emotional shutdown rather than resolution. Accepting that the avoidant person is emotionally disconnected rather than deeply emotional requires grieving the fantasy you've constructed. You wanted them to be a person whose depth matched your own, whose capacity for feeling matched your capacity. Accepting that they're actually operating with a constricted emotional range means accepting that the connection you imagined existing between you doesn't exist in the way you thought. They're not feeling what you're feeling. They're not struggling with the same intensity of emotion. They're experiencing the relationship in a fundamentally different way than you are, with much less emotional depth and complexity. This truth is painful but liberating. Once you stop attributing emotional depth to the avoidant person that they don't possess, you stop waiting for that depth to emerge. You stop trying to access feelings that aren't there. You stop hoping that if you're patient enough, they'll finally express the profound emotions you imagine they're experiencing. You recognize that their emotional disconnection is the reality, not a temporary obstacle to emotional connection. This recognition allows you to stop investing in potential that doesn't exist and start seeing the person in front of you clearly. They're not independent. They're incapable of interdependence. Another pervasive romanticization of avoidant people frames their distance and emotional unavailability as admirable independence. This narrative casts them as self-sufficient individuals who don't need anyone, who are complete within themselves, who have achieved a level of autonomy most people only aspire to. You might admire their apparent ability to be alone without loneliness, to function without requiring validation or support from others, to maintain their sense of self without relying on relationships to define them. This admiration transforms their avoidance into strength, their inability to connect deeply into confident self-reliance. But what appears as independence is actually an inability to engage in interdependence. True independence exists alongside a capacity for healthy dependence and genuine connection. Securely attached people can be alone and enjoy solitude, but they can also be deeply connected when appropriate. They can rely on themselves, but they can also ask for and receive help from others. They can maintain their identity within relationships while also allowing themselves to be affected and shaped by the people they love. This is interdependence, the ability to move fluidly between autonomy and connection, self-reliance and healthy dependence, maintaining self while also being genuinely intimate with others. The avoidant person lacks this fluidity. They're stuck in rigid independence that prevents genuine intimacy. Their self-sufficiency is not a choice, but a compulsion. They're not choosing to be alone and self-reliant because it serves them. They're unable to be any other way because dependence and vulnerability feel intolerable to them. This is a limitation, not strength. It's rigidity, not flexibility. It's fear-driven avoidance, not confident choice. The avoidant person's independence prevents them from experiencing one of the most essential aspects of human existence: genuine interdependence with another person. The capacity to let someone see you fully, to depend on someone and have them depend on you, to build a life where two people are more together than either could be alone. This is what creates the depth and meaning in romantic partnership. The avoidant person's rigid independence means they'll never experience this. They'll never know what it feels like to be truly known by another person. They'll never experience the profound comfort of being able to depend on someone. They'll never build the kind of partnership where two people create something together that neither could create alone. This limitation affects every area of the avoidant person's life, not just romantic relationships. They struggle to ask for help when they need it, suffering alone with problems that could be solved with support. They miss opportunities that require collaboration because they can't work genuinely with others. They experience life's difficulties without the buffer of genuine connection that makes those difficulties more bearable. They're isolated even when surrounded by people because their rigid independence prevents true belonging. This is not admirable self-sufficiency. This is a lonely, constricted existence that prevents access to much of what makes life meaningful. Your romanticization of the avoidant person's independence likely stems from your own relationship with autonomy and dependence. Perhaps you struggle with being too dependent on others, and you admire what appears as the avoidant person's freedom from that struggle. Perhaps you've been hurt by people who were too needy, and the avoidant person's lack of neediness feels refreshing. Perhaps you've lost yourself in previous relationships, and the avoidant person's strong boundaries and self-preservation seem like wisdom you wish you possessed. These personal histories make you vulnerable to viewing the avoidant person's rigidity as strength, rather than recognizing it as limitation. But what you're admiring is actually the flip side of the same dysfunction you're trying to avoid. Anxious dependency and avoidant counterdependency are both dysfunctional patterns that prevent healthy interdependence. The anxiously attached person loses themselves in relationships and relies too heavily on others for a sense of worth and stability. The avoidant person maintains rigid independence and refuses to rely on anyone for anything meaningful. Both patterns prevent the balanced interdependence that characterizes healthy adult relationships. Admiring the avoidant person's pattern because it's the opposite of an anxious pattern is like admiring anorexia because it's the opposite of binge eating. Both are dysfunctional relationships with essential human needs. The avoidant person's inability to engage in interdependence shows up in specific relationship behaviors that you've probably experienced. They won't ask for your help, even when they clearly need it, preferring to struggle alone rather than be vulnerable enough to admit they can't handle something by themselves. They don't share their problems or difficulties with you, keeping you at arm's length even when sharing would deepen connection and allow you to support them. They don't make space for you to depend on them, remaining emotionally unavailable when you need support and treating your needs as burdens rather than normal aspects of partnership. They don't build life with you, but rather maintain a separate life you can visit occasionally. They don't integrate you into their world, but keep you compartmentalized, preventing you from becoming truly essential to their daily existence. They don't make decisions collaboratively, but rather inform you of decisions they've already made. They don't create the intertwined life that partnership involves, but maintain parallel existence where you orbit around them without ever becoming truly integrated into their life. All of these behaviors stem from their inability to engage in genuine interdependence, not from admirable independence. The truth is that the avoidant person's rigid independence makes them a poor partner, not an admirable one. Partnership requires the ability to sometimes put someone else's needs ahead of your own comfort, to sometimes ask for help even when it's uncomfortable, to sometimes depend on someone and let them matter to you, to sometimes prioritize the relationship over your individual preferences. The avoidant person cannot do these things, not because they're admirably independent, but because they're incapable of the flexibility that interdependence requires. Their rigidity prevents them from being the kind of partner who can build a genuine life with someone. Accepting this truth means releasing the romanticized view of the avoidant person as a self-sufficient individual who has achieved admirable autonomy. The reality is they're stuck in a defensive pattern that prevents them from experiencing genuine partnership. They're not choosing independence from a position of strength. They're clinging to independence from a position of fear, unable to risk the vulnerability that interdependence requires. This inability is a limitation that will prevent them from ever being the partner you need, and recognizing it as limitation rather than strength allows you to stop admiring something that is actually preventing the connection you want. They're not protecting their heart, they're protecting their comfort. Perhaps the most damaging romanticization of avoidant people is the narrative that their withdrawal and emotional unavailability stem from past hurt that makes them afraid to open their heart again. This narrative casts them as a wounded soul whose defenses are understandable protection against being hurt the way they were hurt before. You tell yourself they're not running from you, they're running from pain they've experienced previously. You imagine that underneath their walls is a tender heart that's been damaged by past relationships or childhood experiences, and that with enough patience and gentleness, you can help them feel safe enough to lower those walls. This narrative is seductive because it makes the avoidant person's rejection feel less personal, and it suggests a clear path forward. If they're just protecting their wounded heart, then you can prove you're safe. You can demonstrate that you won't hurt them the way others have. You can be the exception who finally helps them heal. This framing also makes their unavailability seem temporary, something they'll move through once they recognize you're trustworthy. It transforms their dysfunction into a romantic challenge that your love might overcome. But this narrative fundamentally misunderstands what the avoidant person is protecting and why. They're not primarily protecting their heart from being hurt again. They're protecting their comfort from being disrupted. They're not afraid of pain, at least not in the acute sense you imagine. They're afraid of discomfort, of vulnerability, of the loss of control that genuine intimacy requires. These are different fears with different implications for whether the avoidant person will ever let you in. The avoidant person's defenses were originally developed in response to childhood experiences where emotional vulnerability was met with rejection, dismissal, or became a burden on caregivers. But these defenses are no longer operating in response to past pain. They're operating in response to present discomfort. The avoidant person has structured their entire adult life around avoiding the discomfort of vulnerability and the loss of control that comes with depending on someone. Their withdrawal from you is not about protecting themselves from a replay of past trauma. It's about protecting themselves from the immediate present discomfort of intimacy. This distinction is crucial because protecting comfort is very different from protecting heart. If the avoidant person were genuinely protecting their heart from being broken again, there would be a path forward through building trust and demonstrating safety. But if they're protecting their comfort from the inherent discomfort of vulnerability, there's no amount of safety you can provide that will make vulnerability comfortable. Intimacy requires vulnerability, and vulnerability is inherently uncomfortable. The avoidant person has organized their life around avoiding discomfort, which means they've organized their life around avoiding genuine intimacy. The avoidant person's pattern is maintained not by fear of catastrophic hurt, but by persistent, low-level avoidance of uncomfortable feelings. They don't withdraw because they're afraid you'll devastate them. They withdraw because beginning to care about you creates mild anxiety that they manage by creating distance. They don't refuse vulnerability because they're terrified of being destroyed. They refuse it because being vulnerable creates discomfort they've spent their life learning to avoid. The stakes feel enormous to you, but to them, it's about managing daily discomfort rather than protecting against traumatic injury. This truth means that the avoidant person is not going to be healed by your love or patience. You cannot make vulnerability comfortable for them. You cannot remove the inherent discomfort that intimacy requires. No matter how safe you make them feel, no matter how much you demonstrate that you won't hurt them, the discomfort of being vulnerable with another person will remain. And as long as avoiding discomfort is their primary organizing principle, they will continue withdrawing from you whenever closeness creates that discomfort. The romanticization of the avoidant person as protecting their wounded heart also obscures the selfishness of their behavior. Framing their withdrawal as protective makes it seem like reasonable self-care. But maintaining walls that prevent genuine connection while keeping you invested and hoping is not self-protection. It's selfishness. The avoidant person is prioritizing their comfort over your needs, their fear of discomfort over your need for intimacy, their desire to remain defended over the relationship's health. This prioritization is not noble or understandable. It's the behavior of someone who is unwilling to tolerate discomfort for the sake of connection. The avoidant person is not a victim of their past who is bravely trying to protect themselves from further harm. They're an adult who is choosing, mostly unconsciously, to prioritize their comfort over the work required for a healthy relationship. They're choosing to remain defended rather than doing the difficult work of expanding their capacity for vulnerability. They're choosing to continue their patterns rather than examining and changing those patterns. These are choices, not inevitable responses to past pain. And these choices reveal that the avoidant person values their comfort more than they value genuine partnership. Accepting this truth requires you to stop giving the avoidant person credit for depth of feeling and fear they probably don't have. They're not lying awake at night, terrified of being hurt, battling with themselves about whether to let you in. They're mostly comfortable in their distance, experiencing minimal internal conflict about their patterns. They might have occasional moments of wondering whether they're missing out, but these are intellectual ponderings, not emotional crises. The dramatic internal battle you imagine them having is a projection of what you would experience, not a reflection of their actual experience. The truth is that the avoidant person is not protecting a precious, tender heart that just needs the right person to feel safe. They're protecting a defended, comfortable existence that prevents them from having to feel very much at all. This protected existence is not preferable to vulnerability. It's a lesser existence. one that prevents access to the depth of connection and meaning that makes life rich. But it's a comfortable existence, one where they feel in control and safe from the discomfort of genuine intimacy. And they've demonstrated through their behavior that they prefer comfortable, defended existence to the discomfort that would be required to build something real with you. They're not worth the wait. They're not doing the work. The final and perhaps most persistent romanticization is the belief that the avoidant person is worth waiting for. That if you're patient enough, they'll eventually heal their wounds and become available for the relationship you want. This belief sustains people through months or years of breadcrumbs, inconsistency, and emotional unavailability. You tell yourself that good things take time, that healing is not linear, that your patience will eventually be rewarded when they finally do the work to change their patterns. You frame your waiting as an investment in the relationship's future, as a demonstration of your commitment and love. But this belief almost always turns out to be a costly delusion. The avoidant person is not doing the work to change their patterns, and they're very unlikely to start doing that work in the future. The patterns that make them unavailable are not temporary obstacles they're actively working to overcome. They're entrenched ways of being that the avoidant person is mostly comfortable with and not motivated to change. Your waiting is not supporting their growth. It's enabling their stagnation. Real change in attachment patterns requires intensive, sustained work that most avoidant people never undertake. It requires therapy with someone specializing in attachment, probably multiple years of consistent sessions. It requires willingness to examine painful childhood experiences and how those experiences shaped current patterns. It requires practicing vulnerability in contexts that feel terrifying. It requires building capacity to tolerate discomfort rather than immediately avoiding it. It requires developing emotional awareness and expression skills that the avoidant person currently lacks. It requires confronting the ways their patterns hurt others and taking responsibility for that harm. This is difficult, expensive, time-consuming work that requires a level of commitment most people, avoidant or otherwise, never master. The avoidant person who is actually doing this work looks very different from the avoidant person you're probably dealing with. The avoidant person doing the work talks explicitly about their attachment patterns and the work they're doing to change them. They're in therapy consistently and can describe what they're learning. They make visible efforts to behave differently, and when they slip into old patterns, they recognize it and repair. They're reading books about attachment, practicing new behaviors, seeking feedback about their patterns. They're uncomfortable much of the time because growth is uncomfortable, but they're choosing that discomfort in service of change. If the avoidant person you're dealing with is not doing these things, they're not working on changing. They might have vague intentions to work on themselves someday. They might acknowledge in an abstract sense that they have patterns that create problems. But intentions without action are meaningless. Awareness without behavior change is useless. If the avoidant person is not actively engaged in the difficult work of change, evidenced by concrete actions and visible efforts, then they're not changing, and they're very unlikely to change in the future. Your waiting is actually counterproductive to the avoidant person's potential growth. When you wait, when you accept their minimal investment, when you remain available despite their unavailability, you're removing the consequences that might motivate change. The avoidant person has no reason to do the difficult work of healing if they can have you in their life without doing that work. Your patience enables their avoidance. Your unconditional acceptance allows them to remain comfortable in their patterns. If you truly want the avoidant person to have any chance of changing, the most helpful thing you can do is leave completely and let them experience the full consequences of their limitations. The romanticization of the avoidant person as worth waiting for also obscures what waiting costs you. Every month you wait is a month you're not healing. not fully moving on, not opening yourself to possibilities with people who are actually available. You're organizing your life around someone else's potential growth rather than around your own actual needs and desires. You're accepting less than you deserve while telling yourself it's temporary, that it will be worth it when they change. But what if they don't change? What if 5 years from now they're exactly the same, and you've spent those 5 years waiting for a transformation that never came?